Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to explain how to use the CrossFilter function. So the video is all about how relationships in your data model affect filters in your report, and we'll start with a quick demonstration of how all that works. We'll then show you how you can manually change the CrossFilter direction and how that affects the measures that you write. Then we'll move on and look at how to use the CrossFilter function to control the CrossFilter direction in every measure that you create. We'll include how you can control multiple relationships in the same measure. And then to finish the video, we'll have a look at how to use measures to synchronize slicers on a report page. So let's get started. To get started, I've already imported our standard list of movies from an Excel workbook, and as usual, I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download and use this file yourself. To begin with, I want to take a quick look at how relationships in our data model affect filters in general in a Power BI report. And to demonstrate that, let's add a couple of visuals to the first page. I'm going to add a basic table visual first, and into that table I'm going to add a couple of fields from my film table. So let's add, say, the title field, and let's also add the release date. I'd like my release date to be displayed as the actual date rather than as the hierarchy, so I'm just going to use the drop-down list here to change that to say release date. I'm just going to reposition that table sitting so it sits roughly in the middle of the page. And then I'd also like to add a couple of slicers to allow me to filter this list of films. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to add a slicer that's going to show me the list of film directors. So I've added my slicer, and then from the director table, I'm going to insert the full name. And then on the other side of my table, I'm going to insert another slicer which shows me the list of film genres. So let's add another slicer, and then from the genre table, we'll insert the genre field. Okay, so there's the basic setup for our visuals. Now, even before we begin selecting items in our slicers, we can make a prediction about what effect that will have on the other visuals on the page by looking at the data model view. So if we switch into the model view using the button on the left-hand side, we can see that each relationship in our data model has an arrow in the middle of the relationship line indicating the direction in which the filters will propagate. So the relationship between director and film is clearly pointing from the director table towards the film table, which means that if I select a director, that will filter the rows in the film table for those where the director matches. Likewise for the genre table, there's an arrow indicating that the filter flows from genre to film, so selecting a genre will filter the list of films. Just to demonstrate that, and not that it really needs much demonstration, but if I were to select Akira Kurosawa as my director back in the report view, the film table filters to show all the films made by Akira Kurosawa. If I deselect Akira and then go to select a genre, let's say awful for example, we get a clear list of the awful films in my database. One thing you might have noticed, however, is that if I were to select a particular director, it filters only the films list and not the list of genres. So that kind of almost indicates to an end user that Akira Kurosawa has directed awful films, which we know clearly cannot possibly be true. Indeed, if I were to select the awful genre as well as Akira Kurosawa as a director, my list of films disappears completely because there are no matching results. Again, this is all to do with the filter direction. If we were to go back to the model view, we can see that selecting a director propagates the filter to the list of films, but filtering the list of films can't then propagate that filter back to the list of genres. So what can we do about that? That's kind of a bit of a misleading thing for the end user working with this list of slicers on this page. I'm just going to clear the filters from each slicer by deselecting each one. And then heading back to the model view, one thing we could do, let's say we wanted to select a director and then have our second slicer show the list of genres that that director has made films in. To do that, we can double click on the relationship line between film and genre. And when the dialog box appears, we can modify this option which says CrossFilter direction in the bottom right hand corner. So from single, we can change that to say both. Once we've done that, we can click OK. And we'll see that the arrow appearing on the relationship line has changed now, indicating that it flows in both directions. So heading back to our report view, let's select Akira Kurosawa again, and we'll see that not only does the list of films filter, but the list of genres filters as well. Based on what we've just seen here, it perhaps sounds like a good idea at this point to change every relationship in our data model to allow filters to propagate in both directions. but that's not necessarily the most sensible course of action. There are a few legitimate reasons for not wanting to allow filters to propagate in both directions. First of all, from a lazy or pragmatic point of view, depending on which way you look at it, it's a bit of a pain to have to go through every single relationship and change the filter direction to say both. And a slightly more serious note, in a more complex data model, allowing multi-directional filters for every single relationship can cause some more serious problems. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but I'm going to point you to this article here from the SQL BI guys. There's a very detailed article which explains why allowing every relationship to filter in both directions can cause some quite serious problems in a data model. So if we're not going to do that, how does that affect how we write measures in our report? Let's head back to our report, and I'm going to create a brand new page, which is going to basically show for each director how many films they've made, but also how many genres those films belong to. So I'm going to start with a new basic table, and in there I'm going to add my director's full name, and then let's add a basic measure to count how many films each director has made. So in my all measures table, I'm going to right click and choose new measure. And then if we just zoom in the formula bar when that appears, let's call this one count of films. And we'll make this simply equal to the result of the count rows function looking at the film table. So once I've entered that measure, I'm then just going to tidy up my all measures table by deleting this column that exists there. Let's delete that from the model. And then I'm going to add my count of films measure into my directors table. So we can see there, hopefully clearly, it's showing us how many films each director has made. Now let's try to do the same thing to count the number of genres represented by the films that each director has made. If I right click all measures and choose new measure, and I'm going to call this one count of genres, and make that equal to count rows, and then refer to the genre table this time. We'll get there eventually. Having done that, I can add that new measure into my table, and that will show me how many genres the films that director has made represent. Now that's working clearly at the moment because of the way the cross-filter direction is set up. If I switch back to my model view, the directors are filtering the films, and the films are then being allowed to propagate that filter back to the genre table. Let's say that we weren't going to allow cross-filter direction to be both on this relationship. Let's double click that relationship line again, switch the direction back to single, and then click OK. And then if we switch back to our report view this time, clearly this is no longer working. So every director's films represent all 24 genres that exist in the genre table. So what can we do to our measure to get the right result when the filter direction is set to single? Well, the answer, as with most of the examples in this section of our tutorial, is to use the calculate function to affect the filters applied to the evaluation of our expression. So let's create a new measure to demonstrate this. I'm going to right click on the all measures table and choose new measure. And I'm going to call this one count of genres. And let's call this one something like cross filter both, or something along those lines. I'm going to make this one equal to the result of the calculate function. I'll hit Shift and Enter to head down to the next line. I'll just zoom out a little bit as well to give myself a bit more space. So the thing I'm trying to calculate is, once again, it's the count rows for the genre table. But I want to affect the filters applied to this expression by using the cross filter function. So this one is designed, if I just get rid of the IntelliSense list there, designed to allow you to specify two columns that are already involved in a relationship and say what cross-filter type to apply to that particular relationship just for this measure. So it completely overrides whatever setting is applied in the data model with the setting you write here. So the trick to this is making sure you reference columns that are involved in a relationship in your data model. So I know that in my film table, the genre ID column has a reference to the genre table, genre ID column. So once I've referenced those two columns for the first two arguments, I can type in one more comma and then say which direction I want the filtering to apply in. So I'm going to choose both for this example, just as we did in the data model itself. I'll close the round brackets for the cross-filter function and then close another set of round brackets for the calculate function. So if I hit enter at this point, and then I were to move that measure into my table, we can see that we're now calculating the correct result for each director, even though the filter direction in the model itself is set to single. And the good news is that this applies regardless of how we're grouping our data in the visual. If I take away the full name field from my table, and let's say we wanted to replace it instead with studio temporarily, let's go to the studio table in the fields list and drag studio into the first column of our table. So we can see that the count of genres is calculating correctly with our new measure, but it's still showing us 24 genres for every single studio in the original one. Let's take studio out and then maybe replace that with country. So we can see hopefully that the measure is working correctly in every single case. The same principle applies to other expressions we might try to evaluate, which rely on that relationship between films and genres. So I guess while it's interesting enough in itself to see how many genres each country represents, it would be more interesting, I think, to see the list of genre names. So let's do that with a new measure. Let's right-click all measures and choose new measure. And I'm going to call this one list of genres. We'll use the concatenate_x function to do this. And we'll go into more detail on this function in a later video, but just for now, I want to set concatenate_x to reference my genre table. Then I want to refer to the genre column in that table. That's the value I want to generate my list of. I want to put maybe a comma and a space between each different genre. So I'll set the delimiter to a literal string, comma and a space. And maybe I like to have those sorted alphabetically by genre name as well. So I'll set the order by expression to refer to the genre column as well. Okay, so at that point were I to enter that measure, if I just simply try to add this one into my table, then we'll see that for every country we get the full list of 24 genres. Because again, at this point, that measure is not accepting the filter from the country field. So the country field is filtering the film table, but that filter is not propagating them back to the genre table. So to fix that, let's go back to the report view. I'm going to grab a copy of my count of genres CrossFilter both, and I'll create a new measure and then paste in all of that code. I'll call this one list of genres CrossFilter both, and then rather than trying to count rows genre, I'm going to replace that with a reference to my list of genres measure. Okay, so once I've done that, I can enter my new measure, and I'll just take away my original list of genres measure and replace that with my list of genres CrossFilter both. So that looks a little more successful to me. We can see that if we've got 4 genres represented by Australia, we can see the names of those 4 genres. So that's all relatively straightforward so far. When there's only one relationship whose filter direction we need to manipulate, we can use a single cross-filter function inside a calculate function to get the result we need. But in a more complicated data model, you may find yourself needing to manipulate the filter direction of multiple relationships in the same measure. Just to create a fairly basic example of that sort of thing, I want to create a new table in my report, which is going to show a list of genres, and then next to each genre, it's going to show the count of countries with films of that genre made in them. But then also next to that, I want to count the world regions which have films of that genre made in them as well. So that's going to involve manipulating 2 relationships in the same measure. Let's build up to that. I'm going to go back to the report view, add a new page. Let's add a new table and insert the genre field into it. Then I'm going to start with a new measure that's going to count the number of countries. So let's add a new measure. We won't bother with the the cross-filter function just yet. So I'm just going to call this one count of countries and make it equal to count rows of the country table. Okay, so we know this one won't give us the right result just yet, but let's use that as a starting point. So for every genre, we can see that we're getting all 19 countries represented. Now I'm going to copy that measure and then create a new one. And then once I've pasted in all the code, we'll manipulate this so that we're going to calculate the count rows of country. So let's wrap the calculate function around this. And then I'm going to use the cross-filter function to make sure that we modify the relationship. So the left column name, it doesn't matter which one I start with, but I know that in my film table, I've got a country ID field, and that has a relationship to the country table, country ID field, and I want the filter direction to go in both directions. So having done that, let's close the extra set of round brackets for the calculate function. And then, oops, beg pardon, of course, I need to rename our measure. Let's call that one count of countries, CrossFilter both, or something along those lines. And then having done that, we can add that measure into the table to get the correct count of countries represented by each genre. Now let's do the same basic thing for the count of world regions. I'm going to go back to my original count of countries measure, and let's just copy that into a new measure. And I'll call this one count of regions. And then rather than the counting the rows of the country table, we'll count the rows of the region table instead. So again, that won't give us the right result just yet. If I add that measure into my table, it gives me the count of all 5 world regions for every single genre. And that can't possibly be true. If the awful genre is represented by a single country, that can't possibly belong to all 5 world regions. So let's now make a copy of the second measure we did to count the countries cross-filter both. I'll paste that into a new measure. I'll call this one count of regions cross-filter both. And then we're going to count the rows of the region table. The first cross-filter function we put in there, we still need. This time we're going to try to propagate filters over 2 different relationships. So we need to propagate the filter from film to country first, and then from country to world region. So in order to do that, we'll need to add in a second cross-filter function. So let's add in a new filter to the calculate function using the cross-filter function. The left column name, again, it doesn't really matter which direction we go in here. I'm going to refer to my country table first and refer to the region ID in there. And then I'm going to refer to the region ID, and again, specify that the filter direction is both. I can then just close the extra set of round brackets for my new cross-filter function, and then hit enter again. And now, if I add in that new measure into the same table, we'll see that we get the correct count of world regions represented by the countries, by the genre. So hopefully what you're getting from this is that it doesn't really matter how you configure the filter directions for the relationships in your data model, because when you write a measure, you can effectively disregard that setting and apply the correct filter direction for the expression you're trying to evaluate. Just to demonstrate that, let's imagine that we had gone to the effort of changing the filter direction for our relationships in the data model to say both. To demonstrate, I'm going to make a duplicate of page 3 by right-clicking on it and choosing Duplicate Page. Then in that table, I'm going to remove the 2 columns that refer to the world region. Now I'd like to create a measure which simply divides one of these columns by the other to get the percentage coverage of countries in my data model by each genre. So that's a fairly simple measure to create. Let's right-click on the All Measures table and choose New Measure. And I'll call this one Country Coverage. I can spell that eventually. There we go. And I'm going to use the divide function for this. And I'm going to refer to 2 measures that I've already created. So it's the count of countries cross-filter both, divided by the count of countries. So we know that at this point, the count of countries is returning the total count of countries in the country table, because the filters aren't propagating back to the country table from the film table. So if I hit enter to create that measure, let's just apply some percentage formatting to it, and then we can add that one into our table. Okay, so there we go. We're getting the percentage coverage of countries for each genre. Now let's say that we'd actually changed the way our data model's filter direction worked. I'm going to go back to the data model view, and I'm going to find the relationship between country and film, double click on that, and then change the cross-filter direction to say both. When I click OK, and then go back to the report view, we'll find now we're dividing the number basically by itself, because the filters are now propagating from the film table to the country table. And I want to do the reverse. So to demonstrate that, let's find our count of country cross-filter both measure. I'm going to make a copy of it. I'm going to create another new measure. Then I'll paste that in. And then I'll change the name of this to say CrossFilter, let's say single. There are several settings for the CrossFilter direction. We've been using both here, basically, for all the examples we've used so far. But if I take away the word both and then press Control and Spacebar to get a list of the other options to reappear, we've got several different options. In the one-to-many relationships that we have in our existing data model, if I want to go back to the original way of filtering, so the single filter direction, then the option to choose there is one way. That will filter from the table at the one end of the relationship back to the table at the many end of the relationship. So it will filter from country to film, but not from film to country. I could be a little more explicit about that as well. I could indicate the exact direction of my relationship here by saying one way, right filters left. I'd choose right filters left in this context simply because of the order in which I've listed my columns. So I've referred to the country ID column of the country table on the right of the film country ID. So I've put film first and then country. So I want the column on the right to filter the one on the left, not the other way around. If I'd put my column names in the opposite way around, then I'd be choosing one way left filters right. But that's unnecessarily complicated with the types of relationships we have. One other option I could choose, I suppose, here as well, is I could say none. So don't propagate any filters from country to film or vice versa. Again, that's a little excessive for this particular example. So let's go back to the one way option. If I enter that measure now, and then if I drop that new measure into my table, we'll see that once again, we're getting the count of all the countries in the country table because the filters aren't propagating to country from film. So the final step would be to modify my country coverage measure to say, divide the count of countries cross-filter both with the count of countries cross-filter single instead. So having done that, if I update that measure, we'll get the correct percentage coverage now displayed again in that table. So ultimately, it doesn't matter how the relationships in your data model are configured, you can write a measure to apply the correct filter direction in any case. So that's everything I had to explain about the cross-filter function for this video, but I have left one small problem unresolved. If you cast your mind back way back to the start of this video, which was only minutes ago, I promise, although it probably feels like hours, we had this situation where we had a pair of slicers that didn't interact with each other. So again, if I just remind you by selecting a director, that doesn't filter the list of genres, nor does selecting a genre filter the list of directors. Traditionally, this was the primary reason, I suppose, for changing the filter direction in the data model to synchronize your slicers correctly. But this kind of changed with the introduction of the ability to apply filters to slicers at the visual level. So just to show you how I'm going to fix this problem, I'm going to temporarily change my genre slicer into a table. And then I'm going to create a new measure that tells me for any genre whether the corresponding list of results in the film table is empty. So I'm going to create a new measure called film is empty. And then I'm going to make this equal to the result of the isEmpty function, and then reference the film table. Okay, so if I enter that measure and then just drop that measure into my genre table, we'll hopefully see at this point, because currently nothing is filtered, that we've got all the genres set to false. So the film table is not empty for any genre. So that must mean there are films belonging to each of the 24 genres. If I selected a director, let's go back to Akira Kurosawa again, we should find now that the genres for action, adventure and drama all say false. So that must mean there are films in that genre, but the ones for all the other genres now say true. So there are no films for those genres for that director. Now, in order to make this work with my slicer, I can't get away with having these Boolean values true and false. I need to convert those into the underlying integer values. So I'm going to go back to my film is empty measure, and I'm going to wrap the int function around the isEmpty function to convert true into 1 and false into 0. So you'll see now that if I just update that measure, the true and false changes to 1 and 0. The beauty of doing that now is that I can apply a filter to that specific visual. So I know it's a table at the moment, but if I were to just expand my filters panel with that table selected, I can go to the film is empty field, which is the filter on this visual, and I can say, show items when the value is, and then enter the number 0. So as we've established, if the number is 0, that must mean there are films for that genre. So if I apply the filter now, we'll see that the genre table shows me only the genres for the director that I select, and that responds every time I select a different director. So the final step then is just to convert that table back into a slicer. I didn't actually need to convert it into the table in the first place to make this system work, it was just for demonstration purposes. So let's change the table back into a slicer. We'll see that the film is empty measure disappears from the slicer, of course, but that's fine. We can now see that if I select Akira Kurosawa, I can select any of Akira's genres to filter that list appropriately. We can make the same thing happen then again if I wanted to select a genre and filter the list of directors. If I select my director slicer without selecting an actual director and then expand the filters panel, I'll need to drag my film is empty measure into the filters on this visual section. And again, I only want to show items in this slicer if that value is 0. Then I can hit the apply filter option. So now if I select a particular genre, I'll find that the slicer full of director names changes to show me directors of films in that genre. So there we go, there's the full solution. You now no longer ever have to change the cross-filter direction in your data model. You can fix all problems just using a combination of measures. So, hope you found that one interesting and useful. Thanks as ever for watching, and we'll see you next time.